So here I was, a young guy who had just moved to the other end of the country, away from family, friends, and girlfriend. But I had to, because the education I wanted could only be found here, in the furthest north of my country. I had found a cozy, small, two-bedroom apartment, with walking distance to my school, supermarkets, and the city center. It was perfect for me. The apartment was located on the second floor of an old, small house, with 2 floors, and 4 apartments in total. When I moved in, there were only one other person living in the house, and that was my downstairs neighbor, Lucas. He was a very nice guy, and helped me with a lot of things when I first moved in. Opposite the house I lived in, there were a big, yellow, and neatly decorated apartment building. From my window in the living room, I could see the apartment building, and almost look directly into people's homes, which I felt was a bit intrusive, but I didn't want to have my curtains down all the time, and when I sat in my living room, it was impossible not to look out of the window, I guess due to my curiousness. After a while, I had kind of gotten to know the different apartments on the other side, and also the people living in them. It still felt weird for me to look at them, but I just told myself that it wasn't weird, and that I was simply just looking out of my window, in my apartment, nothing weird about that. Over the following months I saw a lot of different things from my window. I saw the cute Asian girl in the top right of the building doing yoga with her cat. I saw the young couple living on the first floor, having passionate sex, both in bed, but also directly up against the window. It felt so intrusive watching them have sex, yet I couldn't stop looking, and the fact that they did it with the curtains off, up against the window, made it even harder not to look. The other apartments in the building were inhabited by a couple in their 30s with a little newborn child. They often had their curtains down, so I didn't see much of what they were doing, but it seemed like they were busy taking care of their little newborn, understandably. Then there were another couple, living in the apartment to the right of the young couple. They also had their curtains drawn, almost all day. They were both a bit big in size, and it seemed like they were both enjoying just staying in bed, watching movies, and eating snacks. Last but not least, in the apartment to the left of the cute girl, and above the young couple, I never really saw who lived there, but there were always lights turned on in the apartment, although I never really saw someone walking around in there. I did, however, mostly at night, sometimes see a bald head sticking up from one of the windows in the far side of the building, where it was not as easy for me to see in, as it were in the others. I found it a bit strange, and I began wondering if the person was looking at me, perhaps thinking I was strange, for looking out of my window so much. I brushed it off and thought to myself that it was just some weird person, living a solitary life, not walking around that much, or perhaps I was just not looking when he/her walked around their apartment. After about 6 months living in my new apartment, I noticed that the young couple, whom I had seen have sex so many times by now, were not in their apartment. The lights were off, and it seemed like many of their things were gone. At first, I thought they were maybe on vacation, and would probably return at some point soon. However, weeks went by, and they still hadn't returned, and the apartment stayed the same, dark, half empty, and with no people inside. Well, maybe they had moved out, and I just hadn't been home when they did, so that must have been it. About a week after I had concluded that they had moved out, I noticed that the apartment where the cute girl lived were now also dark, and the decor in the different rooms were not the same as it used to be. Over the next couple of weeks, I looked closely at her apartment, for the smallest indication of life, but there was none. Had she also moved out in an instant, without me noticing? Was she perhaps on a longer vacation? With time, it seemed more likely that it was the first option, that she indeed had moved out. The cat that I had seen her do yoga with were also not there, so they must have moved out, I thought. After these apartments had both been moved out of, I started looking at apartments for rent online, to see if I could see the 2 apartments on the market. However, not one of them were put up for rent. They looked ready for new people to move into, and since there had been no one there, renovating the places, it seemed a bit odd. Just a couple of days after my searches online, I suddenly one day saw that the couple and their baby were not doing their usual morning routine, and that they had their curtains up all day, and all night. This was especially strange because they almost always, except in the morning, had their curtains down. Now, for the first time since I moved in, I had the opportunity to see what they were doing during the day. The only problem was that they weren't there. The light that was usually behind the curtains, a sort of pinkish light, were no longer turned on, and as I said, the curtains were no longer down. This meant that although I had a scarce recollection of what their apartment looked like inside, from the few mornings I had seen them running around in there, the place looked different. Just like the other 2 vacant apartments, it looked dark and half empty. So, if they had also moved out, it was only the movie-watching couple and the weird bald person that were left in the building. The light in the strange person's apartment were still on, yet I still never really saw him. I was beginning to call the person a him, because the few times I had seen his bald head, it looked like he had masculine features, and there are also a lot more bald men than women. One thing I did notice about his apartment were that something had changed like it had in the other apartments. The decor was different, and the lighting seemed even sharper than before. The couple that seemed to just enjoy staying in bed and watching movies had their curtains drawn as usual. However, for many nights in a row, there hadn't been the same flashing lights from their TV that I supposed were hanging over their bed and facing in the direction of my window. I had never been able to see what they were watching, but I had, however, always seen a flashing light coming from their TV. Every night from about 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., it was certain that the TV was on, without any exceptions. But not anymore. A couple of weeks after the parenting couple had moved out, I never saw the TV flashing anymore, not for days, then weeks. Was I going insane, or was the yellow building opposite my apartment just a horrible place to live, since everyone seemed to be moving out? Now, with only one person left in the building, and no new inhabitants, I simply waited for the day where the weird, bald guy would move out, which I thought was inevitable. Weeks passed, months passed, and still the apartments were empty, except for the weird guy's apartment, or, it had always been kind of empty, but there was still this constant light that never seemed to be turned off, and which somehow had grown brighter over time. It didn't seem like he had the same problem living in that building as the rest of the people had. One night, while I was going to my bathroom to pee, I looked out of my window. I saw the usual, bright light coming from the apartment in the top left of the building, but now I also saw that there was light in all the other apartments, which had been dark and empty for months. I wasn't quite sure if I was dreaming, or if I was simply going insane. I looked away for a short while, and then looked again. Now, all of a sudden, the lights were off again, and the only thing I saw was the bald head in the far left window of the building, with the strong light behind it. I felt uneasy, and I felt like I was in some kind of dreamy state, where I was half awake, half asleep. I peed and went back to bed. The next day, I tried to figure out if what I had seen were a dream, or if I had in fact seen it with my own eyes. It was all kind of blurry in my mind, and I decided to talk to my downstairs neighbor Lucas about it. Lucas was about 8 years older than me and had dealt with a lot of stuff through his life, so he was always nice to speak about these types of things with. After a long conversation, Lucas managed to calm me down, telling me that I probably had been in some kind of dreamy state, and that I wasn't going insane. When I asked him if he knew about the building on the other side of the road, he said that it was an old building, and that it was probably the state of the apartments that had caused people to move out. I then asked him about the apartment in the top left corner, the one where the light was always on. He said that it had been empty for over 30 years, and that nobody wanted to live there, because its last tenant, who was a man in his mid-40s, had murdered the rest of the building's tenants, skinned their heads, and hidden their bodies different places in their own apartments. At first, I thought he were telling a spooky story to freak me out, which he did indeed do. But later that evening, I couldn't help my curiosity, and therefore started researching crimes in my area, in the time period Lucas had told me that the murders happened, and there it was. The case was called Psychotic Man Offers Help to His Neighbors, Then Brutally Murders Them, One by One. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was truly going insane, I thought to myself. I looked out of the window, very slowly, trying to not get spotted. I looked up at the window where I had seen the bald head pop up a couple of times before. The light was gone, and there was no bald man to be seen. I let out a relieved sigh. A light suddenly turned on in the apartment where the cute Asian girl used to live. I looked up at the window, and there I saw a man, tall and thin, with a big round head. The head was not bald anymore, it had long, black, hair. The man waved to me, with a grinning smile on his face. It scared me so much I fell to the floor. A couple of seconds later, it knocked on my door. I was scared, but at the same time, I knew that what I had seen were all in my head, because the murderer from the building across the road had died from skin cancer, in prison, many years ago. I got up from the floor, walked shakingly towards the door, with my heart beating out of my chest. I opened the door slowly, and there he was, Lucas, my downstairs neighbor. He said, "Are you okay? I heard a big loud noise coming from your floor. You look as pale a ghost. Listen man, why don't you come down for a cup of tea, and then we can play some PlayStation, what do you think about that?" I stuttered some sort of response, yes, yeah, sure, that would be nice, thank you. As we walked down the stairs to his apartment, I slowly became warmer, shaking less, and with a nice feeling inside, a feeling that I was being helped. Disclaimer. This is an original story, written by me. English is not my first language, so don't come for me.